Welcome everybody. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs, and this is Eye on Africa, our weekly seminary series. We want to welcome everybody, people in the room and also online. So today's speaker is Dr. Claudia Gastrow, and before I pass it over to her, a brief introduction. So Dr. Claudia Gastrow is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. Her research focuses on processes of city making in Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa, exploring how materials, objects, and design can illuminate our understanding of the making of political imaginaries and contemporary capitalism. Her book, The Aesthetics of Belonging, Indigenous Urbanism and City Making in Oil-Boom Luanda, UNC Press 2024, investigates the relationships between politics, aesthetics, and the built environment in urban Angola. Her work has appeared in City and Society, Antipode, and Africa, among other places. She currently serves as an associate editor for the African Studies Review and as a board member of the African Studies Association. Her new project explores Cuban-Angolan collaboration in urban planning and architecture in the 1970s and 1980s, as well as the afterlives of South African sub-imperialism and racial imaginaries through processes of urban financialization in East Africa and the Indian Ocean. Thank you so much for being here. We're grateful.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Awa, so much for staying on top of all the organizational things and the flight delays. Thank you so much, Prof. Zulu, for the invitation. I think he was probably a bit surprised because he sent an email and I think I answered in about 5 minutes saying yes. I've actually always wanted to visit. So people can see. Oh, sorry. That's good. Can they see me? I've always really wanted to visit Michigan State African Studies Center because you guys have the most incredible archives, and I've met some of your grad students who have really floored me with how amazing they are, actually. So yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Peter Leggi, for the podcast today. So I'm going to be presenting a bit on my new book, so I'm just going to dive into it, and I'll really look forward to questions, etc. afterwards. So on the 20th of July, 2009, police, soldiers, and members of Angola's Presidential Guard encircled the neighborhoods of Iraq and Baghdad. It was 3 a.m. The area's dirt roads were relatively quiet during this unusual hour of deep slumber in a city of late-night celebrators and early risers. Moving between concrete block homes, police force startled sleepers out of their houses, harassing and beating those who resisted. Over the next 6 days, residents watched their homes crack and collapse in front of them as demolition teams flattened the neighborhood. Piles of concrete blocks, twisted iron rods, and broken planks remained of what had been homes. One local paper described the scene as, quote, a cavalry of iron tearing everything down. Police later set fire to the temporary accommodation that the despondent former inhabitants had assembled from the rubble, making sure that people would not be able to rebuild. By the time the operation was over, approximately 3,000 houses, home to 15,000 people, had been destroyed. A luxury residential complex commissioned by the Kamama Consortium, a private investment group, was earmarked for building on top of the ruins. So housing demolitions had become increasingly common in Luanda since the end of the Civil War in 2002, as an oil-fueled post-conflict building boom consumed the city. While the growing number of elites, middle-class Angolans, and wealthy foreign migrants benefiting from oil were usually apathetic about demolitions, the scale of this one drew public attention, enough at least to provoke a response from the provincial government. Despite a courts having declared many of the residents' tenure claims valid in 2007 after a previous attempted demolition, when questioned, a representative of the Luanda provincial government explained that it would not be providing compensation to those affected as residents had knowingly built in a state land reserve. The representative appeared unconcerned that these reserves had only been formally delimited in 2007, long after many of the areas that developers were targeting had been established. His explanation for the lack of compensation, however, rested on not only legal, but also aesthetic concerns. In an interview with Radio Ecclesia, the mouthpiece of the Catholic Church in Angola, when asked about the provincial government's refusal to provide compensation, the representative explained that it was not houses that had been destroyed, but, in his words, cabanas de chapa, corrugated iron shacks. His statement indexed how urban and political belonging are fundamentally shaped by entrenched aesthetic orientations rooted in urban materialities that distinguish and classify who and what can be included as part of the city and therefore as part of the broader political community. In his eyes, the materials of the cabanas rendered them incapable of being considered real houses. His classification of these structures as aesthetically beyond the category of house recast the horror of the loss of home as an excusable act undertaken in the name of improving the city. This appeal to the aesthetic surfaced repeatedly during my time in Luanda, as the question of who and what belonged in the city and who and what was considered to embody a desirable form of urbanism was rooted in aesthetic assessments of material, designs, and infrastructure. And so, as I mentioned, today I'm going to be presenting on my book, The Aesthetics of Belonging, which traces how urban aesthetics mediated political belonging during Angola's remarkable post-conflict oil boom, approximately 2002-2014. By aesthetics, I refer to both the material aspects of the built environment, such as design, form, construction materials, and architectural features, as well as the analytical understanding of the term as defined by the almost unconscious judgments of the world based on a person's sensorial engagement with it. Luanda's residents rooted their urban politics in both meanings. During this period, under the auspices of what was called national reconstruction, the Angolan state invested billions of dollars in large-scale infrastructure and housing projects. In 2002, Angola had emerged from a 27-year civil war, a moment that serendipitously intersected with the rapid increase in the international price of oil, the primary source of the Angolan government's revenue. As the second largest oil producer in Africa, this previously debt-stricken country found itself awash in petrodollars. Government investments were also therefore paralleled by surging private investments in real estate and rising consumer demand. As the capital, Luanda was where these processes reached their apotheosis. An urban landscape whose formal areas had remained relatively unchanged since independence in 1975, it was suddenly caught in the midst of rapid transformation. While local circumstances were obviously particular, Luanda's remaking was representative of a larger shift in African urban planning. In countries across the continent, buoyed by the early 2000s commodity boom, state and private funds began to be funneled into what became known as new city projects, these ranged from entirely new cities to new urban precincts. What united these discrepant projects was their embodiment of what has been described as, quote, a utopian urban fantasy that drew on globally circulating ideas and aesthetic imaginations about what constituted a world-class city in order to perform and implement a post-colonial urbanism that appeared freed from the legacies of inequality, poor governance, and uncontrolled growth that both governments and residents believed marred African cities. These projects constituted and continue to constitute, because they're ongoing, an attempt at urban worlding, a search to redefine the existing urban global imaginaries of cities and Africa. Across the continent, however, forced removals enabled the rise of these projects. In Luanda, hundreds of thousands of Musek residents, Musek being the term used in Luanda for, if you want, informal areas, were forcibly removed to state rehousing zones on the urban edge, or simply abandoned with no compensation following demolition, This so that roads could be widened, coastal leisure areas developed, and new upmarket real estate built. And so this story of construction and destruction, I think, would be easily recognizable to anyone who has studied major urban development projects across the globe, especially with the rise of international consulting firms and popular media that allow for kind of policy mobilities while also tapping into transnational imaginaries of what a world-class city is imagined should look like. So now recently, when speaking to someone who had in fact read my book, they said to me that when they first came across it, they wondered why on earth, given all the violence involved in this development, I was interested in aesthetics. And I think the lines were, to kind of paraphrase, they said, no offense, but at first I was like, who cares? So, and to be fair, when I started this project, I was not necessarily intending to work on aesthetics. Luckily for me, the said person said that once they read the book, they said, oh, no, it actually does matter. So that was reassuring. But like the book did for the person, I'm hoping that this talk will provide insight and convince you, if you're not already convinced, that will provide not just the story of Luanda's redevelopment, but convince you that questions of design, materials, objects, and their use not only for planning in a technical sense, but also of their importance to understanding contemporary urban struggles and politics, and more broadly, how we think about the constitution of belonging, equality, and recognition in both African cities and other places around the globe. Now, a number of very wonderful scholars, such as Eric Harms, Asher Gertner, Philippe de Buc, have worked on kind of similar projects in different places around the world and shown how the sort of aesthetic allures of urban development in the form of new buildings, materials, and infrastructures mean that even those who very often are going to be displaced still kind of desire and approve of these projects in certain ways. Other writers who've worked on oil-fueled kind of construction booms have argued that they produce what Andrew Apter has described as seeing as believing ontologies, in which observers mistake consumption and construction spectacles for signs of systemic economic transformation. These arguments have implied that oil aesthetics or construction aesthetics transform citizens into spectators of rather than participants in the state. Oil spectacle has thus historically been understood to entrance, to dim, and to nullify critical capacity, much like the commodity phantasmagorias that Walter Benjamin critiqued in early 20th century Paris. And so while in the broader book, I do show that the desire, especially for bodily comfort, that new infrastructural and architectural investments represented were desired and sought after, ultimately spectacle did not dazzle. And notably, and this is how I came into the project, it was in the register of the aesthetic that those I interacted with expressed their frustrations and shock, focusing on the materials of demolished homes, complaining about the design of government housing, and expressing concern that new apartment blocks architectures were inappropriate for Angolan families. And so in this respect, Luanda's aesthetic politics differs from that commonly associated with understandings of aesthetic spectacles. And it is on this difference that I seek to dwell. Rather than quell dissent, state-driven oil spectacle positioned the aesthetic as an ambivalent site of politics. Far from hegemonic, it was a fragile location through which power, belonging, and critique were exercised and formed. And so it's to this kind of world of aesthetic negotiation and conflict that I want to turn. So in May 2011, I attended a community meeting organized by a local NGO in Kazenga, the most densely populated municipality in Luanda. The meeting was set up to invite representatives of various public institutions to listen to neighborhood concerns and to explain why services were not being delivered. Residents had carefully set up rows of white plastic chairs in a primary school yard, about 90 seats in total, and these all faced a table for invited guests, which had been decorated with large white cloths and festive red ribbons. After waiting more than an hour, the organizers explained that they were running late because they had hoped to begin with the commune administrator, but he had not yet arrived. And so eventually they decided to continue without him, The floor opened and people began to address their concerns to the representative from the city electricity company, taking him to task for power cuts and the lack of public lighting. During this back and forth, the commune administrator arrived and took a seat at the table. After a brief engagement with the police representative, the group's attention turned to the administrator. Now, unlike the audience, each of whom stood up to address the representatives, the administrator remained seated, signifying his power through the ability to remain relaxed in his chair. Without waiting for questions, he began to speak, explaining that he was there in an unofficial capacity, as he had not yet received authorization from the municipal administrator to attend. After listening to the residents' complaints, he moved swiftly to address them, explaining that many of Kazenga's problems emerged from the fact that it was the most populated municipality in the city. With a smile, he enthusiastically told those assembled that the government at last had a solution for this. We're going to reduce the number. We're going to move lots of families to other zones as part of the requalification that Kazenga will undergo. Now, instead of discussing the details of demolition, the administrator focused on the urban provision that removals would enable, promising improved roads and indoor plumbing. For this to be delivered, however, destruction was necessary. And so he says, his words, we will have to get rid of some areas. We'll demolish, and then once the area has been requalified, people can return. He stalwartly ignored the muttering rising from the crowd and described a new rubbish disposal system, new water stands, despite having promised indoor plumbing, and rehabilitated stormwater drainage. All of this would be enabled by demolition, with the administrator promising the crowd, we're going to demolish all the houses we need to. We're going to demolish lots of houses. He seemed oblivious to the concerned murmurings of his audience. He ended his speech by exclaiming that he was extremely, quote, satisfied with his visit. So these kinds of statements, which were common in Luanda, are, I argue, part of the way in which the state used infrastructure and urban aesthetics to repackage violence as a form of care. In these conversations, demolition was presented as that which allowed kind of a bringing into political recognition, in fact, through the promise of comfort and aesthetic sensorial citizenship. So, the feeling of water, being clean, having access to kind of a cold refrigerator, based in the embodied experience of better housing and services. And so while in the broader book, I explore the complexities of spectacle, and especially these promises of embodied comfort that it proffered, in this instance, what I want to draw attention to is the imagination of the Musex, these informal areas, that underlay the kinds of interactions I just discussed. Because throughout my research, I would ask, how was it possible to proudly state that you were going to engage in demolishing areas which housed the majority of the city and which thousands of dollars and hours of labor had been invested? How could someone get up and say that so easily? The answer, I suggest, is the inability to recognize the aesthetic worth of these areas, a problem not just of administrators, but of scholars. And so I want you to think of a scene on TV. The camera pans over the buildings of Luanda's Praia do Bispo neighborhood, kind of mixture of self-built and colonial era, quite fancy era buildings. Everything is tinged a muted gray by the dawn light. The perspective then suddenly switches to a close-up image of the coastline. The water is clogged with rubbish. A voiceover starts. Candida Correa, 27 years old, begins to give context. The shots move between images of corrugated iron and concrete block houses, goats chewing on garbage strewn between buildings, and Candida and her husband looking lovingly at family photos. Candida explains that where she and her husband had built their life in the city, there was raw sewage, piles of rubbish, and no clean water. She wipes the tears from her face as the camera zooms in. The scene switches to Zango, what was then Angola's largest rehousing area, showing her husband and children planting flowers in their new garden. Images appear of the family watching television and taking a leisurely stroll in the neighborhood. Her children laugh as they run into their new home and turn on water taps. Candida explains to the viewers, in her words, "The government went there, knocked down our houses, and gave us keys. I could hardly contain my emotions when they called my name. I couldn't believe it. And now I have a big house. Here they can play. It's really great. They have their own room. Sometimes they ask me to turn on the shower when they want. I am well. I am happy. I have my house, my family, and I thank God for this house." The advertisement just described was part of the MPLA 2012 electoral campaign, in which the party focused heavily on its delivery of post-conflict housing and infrastructure across Luanda as rescuing the population from Musex. Catherine McKittrick describes the kinds of representational practices engaged in by MPLA propaganda, in which dominant aesthetic, material, and geographical imaginaries delegitimize what she calls the physical and material configurations of Black life as processes that render people, place, and history, quote, ungeographic. In this case, representations of Musex architecture and materials, alongside images of poverty and dirt, made it difficult to locate the histories of change, skill, and design that inhered in them. Despite the fact that Musex are imagined as the birthplaces of Angolan nationalism and the primary location of contemporary urban identity, despite the fact that their formation and construction processes can be traced back to settlements in Luanda of enslaved and free Africans from at least the 17th century, they are not seen as fundamental to the city's spatial, architectural, and material heritage. This denigration of the Musex material and spatial contribution to Luanda reproduces what Abdulmalik Simone describes as, quote, a constitutive paradox to Black urbanism, in that in many parts of the world, Blackness informs what it means to be urban in a cultural sense, but still struggles for recognition as a critical factor in the production of urban space. It is with this in mind that in the larger book, I argue that the Musex, and indeed similar areas around the world, rather than glassed as informal, might be better understood as an indigenous Black urbanism that provides a material location from which to reconfigure and critique logics and practices of power that run through official forms of planning and scholarship. Drawing on Heather Dari's work on North America, which points out that indigeneity is not simply an identity, but an emergent relational and political position to space, land, and in the context of North America and Southern Africa, especially to settler colonialism, I highlight that while the historically formal areas of Luanda, often referred to simply as Cidade or city, might be indigenous, if you want, with a small I, inasmuch as these areas were partially built and designed by Angolans, they perhaps cannot be considered indigenous with a big I, inasmuch as their formality, design, and expansion, their aesthetics, are rooted in and continue to reproduce histories and structural logics of extraction and displacement. The description of Musex as indigenous, then, refers to a relational identity of personhood and built form that emerges through construction, often in the shadow of the violent enforcement of normative urbanisms. This effacement of African material contributions is, however, not limited to Angolan state officials. While scholars have recognized the existence of urban spaces that predate colonial encounters and encroachment, the possibility of an African indigeneity being born from colonial urbanism has not been as actively addressed. As in the North American context, settler colonialism in Africa was premised on not only a terra nullius, but also what Glenn Coulthard, working in Canada, describes as an urbs nullius, in which cities were imagined as, but obviously were not ever actually, white spaces devoid of any indigenous urbanism, devoid of any indigenous influence on their formation. And the indigenous were represented as alien to the urban. So while colonial governments have long officially decamped, racialized assemblages of planning and disavowal continue to wind a path through contemporary conceptualizations of African cities. Appeals to the supposed flimsy construction of Musex housing, descriptions of it as disorderly, anarchic, and provisional, all serve to undermine Musex's contribution to city-making, as well as the political possibilities emerging from them. In the case of economic informality, Scholars have attempted to overcome descriptions of practices as supposedly deviant by showing how logics of organization and possibilities for survival emerge through informal interactions and processes. Rather than being signs of failure or chaos, informality and the ephemeral and makeshift relations and opportunities through which cities work are now, in most literature, seen as the redemptive means through which African residents maintain and recreate personal opportunities in the face of the implosion of state capacity and significant economic obstacles. Now, as important as the above literature has been for reimagining African urbanism in the last 2 decades, and it has been incredibly important, the salvaging of economic informality in contemporary literature has often been at the expense of a critical engagement with the materiality of informality. This is partially because the literature has often opposed the vibrancy of economic and cultural life to the material world, framing African urban residents as surviving in spite of what is portrayed as kind of the crumbling provisional material world that surrounds them. Now, while exposing the fallacy of equating informality to disorder, the insistence on provisionality and ephemerality as the primary characteristics of African urban life means that this work has done little to question the presumptions that underlie the dismissal of the materiality of neighborhoods such as the Musex, which precisely emerge from claims that they are poorly constructed, therefore provisional and ephemeral, and therefore disliked by their inhabitants. The result has been a larger trend in scholarship about post-Cold War urban Africa, whose cumulative effect, Mike Degani argues, is, quote, to emphasize a certain kind of formlessness. Such accounts of the built environment implicitly imagine modernist planning as the sign of permanence, ultimately leaving dominant readings of space intact. Formality and informality, provisionality and permanence, however, are not opposed conditions. As Atto Quayson reminds us, nothing is ephemeral or concrete, but framing makes it so. It would be useful then to see the provisional, informal, and ephemeral as framings that produce certain visions of the city, while simultaneously foreclosing other imaginations that nevertheless coexist as potentialities in space and time. Musex might be provisional and informal inasmuch as they are characterized as beyond the reaches of the state, although they are in fact complexly bound to state institutions, and the materialities are demonized by official institutions. But they are permanent and very much have like a material presence, inasmuch as they have deep histories of formation and reproduction that emerged out of the demands of making place under conditions of structural exclusion. This permanence, in turn, produces political imaginaries that are missed when indigenous urbanisms are overlooked. And so I'm going to move us into one kind of particular Musek area. So hundreds of houses in various stages of completion dotted the hills in front of Walter and I, bordered by piles of sand, cement, and concrete blocks that indicated investments in ongoing processes of construction. Walter had purchased land in Mundial, where we were now, in 2009, from what he described as camponeses, kind of, if you want, peasant farmers, but I'll explain the translation a bit more later, who were cultivating in the area as he speculated on future urban growth. Given that few Angolans trusted the country's banking system, land and housing were viewed as the most reliable form of saving and financial security, even in the face of weak property rights. As Nuno, a friend of mine, explained to me, construction materials were, quote, money that won't go bad. With the acceleration of demolitions in the post-conflict era, however, the certainty and the safety of investing in housing had been slightly shaken. Walter had therefore sold a part of his land in Mundial to someone else looking to build and waited to see if the administration would send someone to demolish the purchaser's home. When, after about a year, no demolition occurred, he and his brothers began to build. Walter was still building, with the intention of moving there the following year with his wife and young daughter. The area would be a base from which to expand his fledgling minibus taxi business. And so the process of incremental city building revealed itself, as you can see, in the materiality of the area. Heaped next to half-built homes or piled in empty plots were mounds of concrete block bricks, small stones and sand, symbolizing the owner's dream one day to have a casa de bloco, a concrete block house, the object on which much money and effort was expended. Now, when Walter, his brothers, and thousands of others constructed their homes, they were participating in a long-standing urban tradition of building, even if one defined by practices of fugitivity, incremental construction, and unpredictable possibilities of emplacement. While the independence government tried to convince people to abandon the practice, those who could not access housing left behind by settlers generally had to build their own houses. Unofficial land occupations, either through invasion or purchase, became the primary means through which people established themselves in the city. When couples married or people arrived needing somewhere to live, they would try to find a plot through family connections or friends. If necessary, they would travel to the urban periphery and acquire among camponeses if any of them were looking to sell. These processes were not always amicable. Knowing the value of land, police might begin to sell plots without their owner's consent. Sometimes those in search of land simply invaded. Once land was procured, the new owner would swiftly erect a corrugated iron house to mark ownership. Those who had the means might erect a perimeter fence and even ask a relative to live in the house to make sure that no one would try to occupy the plot. Then the slow process of purchasing bricks, cement, sand, and rocks began. The basic house with which most people started consisted of 2 rooms and a sloping roof to enable rainwater to wash off. The initial investment to build this was considerable. When I interviewed a pedreiro, a kind of house builder, informal house builder if you want, about the cost of building a poor quality 2-bedroom concrete block home, together we arrived at an estimate of about $6,000, which excluded the cost of the land. Once the basic unit was built, those who could gradually added on to their houses. As in many places across the continent, this process could take years and in reality often continued throughout an individual's life. Economic success was signaled through extensions and improvements, such as plastering the home and tiles on the floor. This building process gave form to life cycle and kinship relations, situating the house as a site in which hopes for social reproduction were invested. This was partially because of the association of housing construction with marriage, and because people tended to try to live in an area where they had kin. The family was also central to the actual construction of the house, even though those who could afford it hired a pedreiro to assist with at least the initial design and foundations. But it was not only the family that produced the house. The house also produced the family, providing a means for its everyday reproduction. Once a basic house had been built and the yard fenced, the yard became a space that provided economic opportunities, as well as the central site of sociality. People regularly cut windows into the walls of their yards to sell kind of drinks or snacks from them. Other people built additional rooms and rented them out to new arrivals, who were also looking to eventually build. Yards could accommodate small businesses like schools or medical practices, and were also a place for relaxation or sleep on hot summer evenings. The house became the site through which the everyday texture of the city emerged, assembling family, life course, urban belonging, and financial stability into one object. Long established construction practices marked the self-built Musek house as an urban tradition rather than a provisional act. The concrete block house was arguably the elementary unit of the city. And so, if it was possible to track the historical rootedness of the Museks and their production of the urban through patterns of construction and planning, the political significance of this became evident in settlement narratives. Residents often spoke of the Museks as being the home to what they called the proprio Angolan, the real Angolan, testifying to a sense of cultural authenticity rooted in the materiality and sociality of Musek life. This sense of the Musek dweller as the original inhabitant of the city, if not the land per se, was evident in narratives of occupation that framed the land where neighborhoods now existed as undeveloped prior to the arrival of self-builders or auto-constructors. A member of the residence committee of Mabosonef in Kazanga, for instance, explained that when people began to arrive in the area around 1978, all that existed were a few farms that had belonged to, in his words, the colonists, but everything else was grass. People had to, quote, clear grass themselves until they began to build. When I inquired if anyone from the state had attempted to assist, he laughed at me. He explained that it was the people, Upovu, who had laid the roads, demarcated the blocks, and created the area. Now, while the details of this account might have differed from area to area, what was noticeable was the language used to describe these neighborhoods prior to the construction of housing, which tended to focus on, quote, their wilderness or wildness. Several similarities stand out in these narratives. It is in fact common to admit that land was purchased from or ceded by camponeses, who are identified as the original owners of the land. Translated literally as peasant, camponese is more accurately used to refer to small-scale food producers who are viewed as the original occupants of the land. And there's a very complicated history to why the word is used so ubiquitously in Angola, which we can speak to if anybody wants to know. Auto-constructors distinguished between the farming activity of the camponeses, which they grouped in the same category as matu, bush, or capim grass, versus the construction of housing and the making of bairros, neighborhoods. Camponeses therefore hold the ambiguous position of providing a legitimating anchor and proving that auto-constructors were ceded land from the original inhabitants, but are grouped, like I said, as closer to bush than bairro, in order to distinguish the centrality of construction to the making of urban status. The house became the anchoring point for legitimation, the thing that transformed precarious occupation into first-comer status. In cases where it would be difficult to claim that there was nothing but bush in the area, an alternative narrative of urban indigeneity focused on rightful appropriation from departing settlers. This right to first-comer status through occupation was evident in the tale of Pedro. Pedro had purchased his plot at independence from a departing Portuguese man. When I asked if he and others who had occupied or bought land at the time had registered it with the state, he said they had not. At the time, he explained, when you occupied land, you typically put up a sign with your name on it and needed to be, quote, clear that the land was yours. A corresponding story of occupation was elaborated by an old man in Hojiahenda, a neighborhood in the municipality of Sambizanga. He had come to Luanda in 1979 from Malange, where he had worked as a driver. His cousin was living in a house that had been left to him by his white employer, who had fled the country in the run-up to independence. His cousin was interested in moving to Malange, so they swapped houses, with the old man taking unofficial ownership of the house where he still lived. At some point, a member of a neighborhood commission had taken him to officially register the house, after which he had to pay rent to the Ministry of Construction and Housing. Now, these narratives of settlement, unlike colonial ones that portray land as empty, recognize the previous owners of the land, whether legitimate, like the camponeses, or illegitimate, such as colonial settlers. Musek residents, then, do not claim to be autochthonous to the land, but similarly to the Comorian migrants to coastal Madagascar described by Tasharek Epstein, by building houses and crafting kinship and social relations to the original legitimate inhabitants of the land, they, quote, created their legitimate status as those who belonged to the soil of the city. In this sense, they echo legitimation myths that are in fact characteristic of political ideologies across much of Central Africa regarding first-comers versus settlers. As Kern Kleeman notes in her study of pre-colonial Bantu and Batwa interactions, Bantu-speaking settlers represented themselves as the legitimate rulers of lands that they usurped from the Batwa by creating mythic histories that positioned them as producing civilization from wilderness. Bantu settlers created fictive kin relations to the Batwa, but simultaneously, in her words, quote, symbolically deculturalized them by arguing that their settlements were pre-civilized and wild, thereby portraying the Batwa as forest rather than village people. As such, Bantu settlers became the harbingers of civilization and makers of meaningful territorial presence that legitimated their first-comer claims in relation to other groups and the colonial state. Lisa Melky noted similar tropes of what she calls mythico-history narratives used to root first-comer claims for political positioning among Hutu refugees in Tanzania and their descriptions of their relations to Burundian Tutsis and Twa. While Tutsis were portrayed as usurpers of Hutu land, the Twa were described as equally autochthonous but inferior because they had failed to embrace, quote, civilization. Drawing on indigenous political understandings of settlement and relationality, Musek residents positioned themselves as the legitimate autochthons of the city, not necessarily the land, through their acts of construction. That moment of first-comer claim-making stands in opposition to the settler colonial claims of the former the settler colonial claims of the formalizing city and those who drive its extension. It thereby opened up a field of political debate rooted in aesthetic judgment, as arguments over what forms, materials, and construction practices could be considered urban, were desirable, and enjoyed recognition, and therefore which people enjoyed recognition, became a means through which Luandans engaged the state and private developers. While residents were drawn to the bodily comforts of government designs, they decried the rejection of their own material products. Museks also exist in conversation with Camponeses, who Musek residents at times poached lands from, but at other times collaborated and enjoyed relations of mutuality with. Museks forged a relationship with the city and imaginations of belonging shaped by long histories of Black placemaking that emerged through ambivalent relations to the Ciudad. Musek houses, the elementary units of the city, expanded Luanda both materially and institutionally. They called the city into being, and with it generated a material experience of indigeneity that became the grounds for political dissensus during the oil boom, as new urban aesthetic forms failed to recognize the indigenous urbanism that they actively displaced. Now, the case of Luanda during the oil boom offers an opportunity to better understand how material and aesthetic orientations shape contestations over the urban, and with that, political belonging. It shows how the city itself acts as a political resource. Recognizing the critical potential of Musek materiality, however, does not mean we need to romanticize these spaces. Life in Museks can be hard. Residents must manage often severe water and electricity shortages. Their health suffers because of often non-existent sanitation and trash collection systems. Arguing for the recognition of how histories of construction produce senses of political belonging should not be mistaken for saying that all is well. In contrast, the government's success in appealing to aesthetic comfort suggests that people desperately want the services proffered by new city plans. Nevertheless, in the same way as studies now recognize the critical role of provisional social relations in the making of urban life and space, they must do so for the informal material world. Angolan architect Angela Mingas, one of the few voices to publicly defend the Museks as sites of architectural and historical significance, has emphasized that, in her words, and I quote, "The idea of the Musek is not to defend people's poor quality of life, but to defend the origins of the Musek. At this moment, we are still in the process of comprehending exactly what this centuries-old phenomenon emerging from Luanda is. Recognizing not just the Museks, but other similar spaces, historical formation, and contribution to the production of urban space, place, and meaning might shift how African cities are planned and conceived. Museks are a sign of abandonment, but also of lives made, futures imagined, and aspirations fulfilled. They have a material history and aesthetic world that could contribute to richer imaginations of urban futures and possibilities. In their concern with the provisionality of the informal, contemporary studies of African urbanism have failed to recognize the political materiality of these areas, and with that, the utopian aspirations that inhere in them. As spaces that dwell both within and outside the normative visions of urbanism that have shaped Luanda's growth, Museks are both the site of the assertion of political claims, as well as often the impossibility of such assertions in the face of systematized attempts to delegitimize and destroy these spaces. Museks constitute an indigenous Black urbanism that builds material communities of belonging to the city, a counter-geography of sentiment, history, and placemaking, only notable when assumptions rooted in aesthetic judgments about what constitutes a proper house, acceptable design, permanent construction, and good urbanism are reconsidered. David Harvey reminds us that, quote, aesthetic values are central in realizing the right to the city. This is not only because the power to shape the aesthetic is also the power to shape the political and socioeconomic future of the city. It is also because, as Lewis Gordon argues, the recognition of one's aesthetic life is a recognition of the value of that life. It is this recognition of the value of their lives, and therefore of the material expression thereof, that the majority of Luandans have not enjoyed. Their contributions to the making of the city have been historically glassed as provisional, fully constructed, and undesirable, rather than recognized as spaces of meaningful urbanism. The histories they represent have not been grappled with. This majority has never been invited to explain what they want from a future city. The exclusion of the majority and their aesthetic worlds has been and will continue to be one of Luanda's primary political problems until such time as there is a means to not simply incorporate them into an overarching normative urbanism, but to readjust conceptualizations of the urban to recognize their contributions. The problem of urban megaprojects, arguably, is not simply that they are implemented by elites, but that they are undemocratic in their aesthetic imaginations because they tend to emerge out of undemocratic processes. Only by taking seriously the aesthetic challenge provided by spaces usually framed as deviant, namely the Musek and its counterparts across the globe, can we begin to track alternative, locally emergent aesthetic visions of cities and histories of power that have shaped our urbanscapes. In doing this, sites of struggle, love, intimacy, and community, usually ignored by elite-dominated distributions of the sensible, come into focus.
Thank you so very much. That was very, very interesting. So we're gonna take questions now and we'll start in the room, and then people online, you can either type your questions or raise your hand and be allowed to ask it out. Any questions or comments from the room?
Hi, my name is Zachary. I'm a first year PhD student in the history program. I just have one question. I hope it's maybe two-sided. So when you're talking about the Museks as places of identity creation and the place where the family is created, in the earlier part of your presentation, you talked about the threat of these Museks being demolished and or the new layouts that these people going into the Museks were creating, or their environments were being demolished that they knew. So I guess my main question is, how do you see the change in the layout of the Museks or the city impacting the identity of the inhabitants? How was their daily interactions with the new environment changed? And did that new daily interaction impact their sense of self or identity?
Thank you. That's a wonderful. Am I taking them one by one or? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much. That's a great question. So there's kind of two parts to answer. So when I was doing the research, a lot of these projects were still going up. Some of them had been built. So to properly answer it, I would need to do like a study now, 10 years on. But in terms of people speculating about the layouts, they were concerned about what it meant, especially, well, let me backtrack. I think we need to start with the presumption that when we look at a design, right, a design, and I talked about this briefly with Peter, a design already presumes a particular kind of inhabitant. So if you design a house with no yard, that means you're presuming an inhabitant is a particular economic source who does not need a yard to sustain themselves, right? If you design a house with only 2 bedrooms, you are presuming a particular kind of family generally, right? So we need to understand that kind of presumptions about family, et cetera, are already inherent in the design. So what happened, people would look at this design and even before moving in, already feel alienated from it, right? Because they're looking at something which before they've even used it is telling them that they are the wrong kind of economic subject, the wrong kind of kinship form, the wrong kind of everything already. And so there's kind of the engagement with the plan and alienation and concern about that. Like I said, a lot of people used yards to try and sell something. Now, when people moved into spaces, and most people in the Museks, when they were not moved into high rises, for instance. And it's interesting, I've seen in Luanda, for instance, people opening informal restaurants on rooftops as like a way of working with the high rise, or selling things from the entrance of a high rise because there's not like a yard to sell it from. So but those are adaptations, if you want, of those buildings that have existed for a very long time. I mean, like during the colonial period, probably all that. What people did when they were moved into the state projects, which looked, I'm going to flick that like that, and you can kind of see in that one picture, is they started trying to like expand and add on and kind of create what they had in Musek areas. So yards, gardens, people would raise the roofs because they said, I mean, they generally felt that whilst they were happy to have infrastructural connection, the buildings were poorly designed for them. The roofs were too low, which made the building hot. So there was a lot of kind of attempted rebuilding and redesign to whatever extent was possible of these constructions. And so these areas, like this photo was of an area that had really just been completed. And people, I mean, this was taken, I think, in 2012 or 2011, but the process of removing people started in 2001. So the older parts look different. You've seen more additions, etc. And so, I mean, people adapted, and this is what a lot of government officials didn't like. At first, they tried to control like what kinds of doors you could use. They tried to impose penalties for kind of knocking things down, but it didn't work. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, that answered it perfectly.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Anybody else? Okay, we have somebody online. Professor Kanani, you can ask your question. You're unmuted.
Hello?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. There's so much in here that I don't, I really appreciate you covering this. Looking at the timeline, when you started, when you went there, and there was continuous building or constructions, the terms of compensation of the indigenous people and so on, which was a challenge.
Mm.
When you look back now, how do people feel now? Are they happy, or are they, what's the mood now? If you were to go back, or I don't know whether you still have some contacts, you know, dismantling their, you know, homes. Granted, they put their probably better buildings, but how do they think now?
Thank you so much for that question. Sorry, I can't see you on my screen. So I hope I look like I'm speaking to you properly. So I mean, to be honest, I think it's mixed, and that's why I also like to think of aesthetic politics as something ambiguous. I think there's a tendency to want to say like everybody hates something or everybody loves something. Some of the people who were moved to Zangu were happy to get a house in Zangu for various reasons. It might have been the infrastructural connection. They might just, you know, like, so even at the time, I would say, whilst there was broad outrage about having a house demolished, and most people did not want to have their houses demolished because these houses were not seen as kind of desirable. Over time, for instance, some people rented these houses out and moved back closer to the city. And so I think when we approach these stories, we need to realize that, as always, people kind of make do with what they have. So I would think most of the people that I am still in contact with are angry about having had their homes demolished and what that meant, but have made do with kind of what was offered to them in some instances. So I'm at this moment talking about people who actually got homes. So people who got homes, like I said, very often rented them out, added on to them. And these areas have changed. They've become what was seen as very far out the city, is now kind of incorporated into the city. Luanda has expanded dramatically over the last 10 years. So this area doesn't look like this. So I think there's kind of an ambivalent feeling from people who were given homes, and it depends what was involved. Some people were moved out, lost their jobs, had to send their children to live with other people. Those people are still feeling very often very aggrieved. Other people built whole new lives out of periphery and actually feel that maybe it worked out for them in the end. So I think you're going to get a lot of different stories from kind of this area 10, 15 years on. But my experience is generally the process and experience of demolition is still viewed as something negative and sort of traumatic that happened to people. In contrast, you have a large group of people who were never rehoused and received no compensation. And that is a group of people who are more difficult to track long-term because they move, they go to other provinces, cell phone numbers get lost. I have not seen kind of a happy story result out of that, largely because people sometimes find themselves stuck in kind of cycles of removals or precarity or sort of houselessness. And so, like I said, for people who receive property, I think there is kind of a more complex story going on. For people who did not receive compensation, I think there is still quite a lot of bitterness, and a lot of it also has to do with kind of the loss of neighborhood bonds and being really forced outside of the central city. So I think you're looking at a mixed bag depending on kind of what your outcome was from that process.
What was the criteria for people being compensated and others not being compensated?
That is a very interesting story. So not what might expect, which would be like some kind of proof of formal tenure. Demolition teams would measure the size of the house. So material, aesthetic, actually. Measure the size of the house, look how many rooms it has, estimate what they consider to be the quality of the house. See if there were kind of additional outhouses that had been built, etc. And then based on that assessment, generally, if your house was considered either good enough quality or as big as one of the houses in the rehousing zone, you would receive a house. And if it was considered poor quality or smaller, you might receive financial compensation or nothing. In some cases, no one got anything. So there were also kind of private demolitions, which were opportunistically done. So where people received nothing as well. But in the cases where people did receive compensation, it was generally not actually based on being able to prove kind of state-sanctioned tenure, but actually on what the house looked like.
I'm sorry to monopolize, but so you're talking about the buildings.
Yeah.
Did those people own the piece of land that where the houses were? So if the house was very poor, but the land is still belonged to them, will that be good to compensate them?
So the problem in Angola is, so all land technically belongs to the state. But
okay.
What happened, but still you could register for like a lease or something, but during the Civil War, the land registration process basically broke down. And there wasn't actually an official law gazetted that dealt with urban land specifically. So rural land, there were already some protections for what were described as camponeses, for kind of, if you want sort of like customary land ownership, there were some kind of minimal protections built in. But for urban land originally, there were very few. Then they introduced new land laws, and I'm going to forget the name. I think, sorry, not the name. I'm going to forget the. I think 2004. I'd have to double check. But the new land law retroactively takes away recognition of good faith occupation unless you registered your land with the state according to a 1992 regulation, of which most people were unable to because of the Civil War. So as far as the courts are concerned, none of these people actually legitimately own land. So what you can get compensation for is the house, but not the land, unless they recognize you as a camponés, in which case they like in theory, and again, this is usually state projects, private developers tended to not provide any kind of compensation, but state developments might provide compensation for land to camponeses, but then also far less than the actual market value of that land.
Thank you.
Sure. Peter?
Similar question to what Prof. Kanana just asked. Who owns the homes? What kind of arrangement is there? Are they leasing them? Are they private owners? Are they renters? And does it differ between the state projects and the private developers? And is there like a business? Because areas I'm familiar with, not just in Southern Africa, but where I come from and also here sometimes, public housing in particular generates a kind of underground economy.
Yeah.
Some of it cleaner than in other places.
So unless something has changed, the state owns these houses, but people were not paying rent. So they kind of got moved into them. Some of them were issued a document which said that they had been moved into them. Some of them were not. Every once in a while, like, I don't know, maybe like a few people, or like there was like a political performance of giving some people an ownership document, but there was nothing systematic. So people were living here, they'd been issued a key. So what happened was like they would come and take people away in trucks. Like there'd be a survey done at some point that your area is going to be demolished. At some point, it could be 6 months, it could be 6 years. Trucks, buses would come, they would get people on, they would load the furniture, they would drive out to an area like this. And based on the survey that had been done, call out people's names, hand them a key, and get them to walk through the area trying to look, and the house number, trying to locate the house. And that was what showed that the house was yours. Now, again, at different moments, there've been and this is like a massive area. We're talking about like units for a few 100,000 people. So the state didn't have like a good hold on what was going on, even as it was constructing the stuff. What did develop was like a really active market in sales and rentals in this area. So a lot of people would sell the house, even if there is no official proof of ownership, use the money, move back to the center, build something there. And so there's a woman called Sylvia Cruz who worked specifically in Zango, who's really shown how some people accumulated multiple houses, actually. So they would go back and build. So they would rent out a house, use the money, go back and build, get demolished again, come back, get a second house, rent it out, go back, build, get demolished, go back, get a third. So there was like a real, I don't want to diminish the fact demolition, but there were definitely some kind of entrepreneurial activities involved in the process. Police and people involved in demolition, according to people I interviewed here, would very often get their names put onto the list so that they could get houses off the main road and turn them into businesses. So there's like an active, and that's the question about how people felt. I was like, it kind of depends where you sit on the range. For some people, this is like an economic gold mine. And for other people, it's being dumped out kilometers from the city center with no way to get to work and kids out of school. So it's really discrepant, but there is a massive market, but all of it kind of informally based. And that is emerging even from the socialist era already, where you were in theory not allowed to sell the property you were renting from, et cetera, but people did it anyway and passed on keys, et cetera. So this is, again, a long-running practice that has just kind of been transferred into another location.
If I could just follow up, do these transfers, exchanges happen in public? Is there a place where people gather and say, okay, you know, my son's getting married, what have you, you know, this family needs a place. Let's set up the scheme where you go back to the city for a certain, you know, is there a place where this happens, or is it quieter on the down low?
I mean,
putting yourself in.
My impression is it's just like a everyday thing that people are doing. So it's not like some planned, I mean, maybe there's some people who are really planning it, but my impression from people I spoke to and what I've read is that you might just have one person who's a bit entrepreneurial. It's like, I figured out, so like some people would try and find out when demolitions were going to happen and then like try and build as quickly as they could in those areas. So I really want to say that this doesn't mean that other people, you know, did not suffer in this, but there is a very much that kind of process. And even in the more upmarket areas, it is kind of it is very confusing who owns what, because a lot of these places, like the upmarket middle class areas, if you want, people were given like 20-year bonds from whatever, home loans, mortgages, from which were backed by the state and were like meant to be paying them off, but then sold the house without telling anyone through like an informal transaction, have stopped paying the mortgage. Someone else is now living in the house. And I don't know, when someone comes to collect one day, I don't know what's going to happen. Or if anything, sorry. I don't know who's taking this. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is close to what Peter's already asked. What other efforts were made by the government besides just building this dwelling to connect the people with some kind of economy so that they have a means of livelihood?
Not much. So like, this is not what I very often say about this program, is that like people, I mean, just because I was previously working in South Africa, people very often compare it, like when in South Africa, it'd be like, oh, it's like the Reconstruction and Development Program, right? You go on a list. That's not what happened here. There's not like a housing list where people are like waiting, and you got a house if your house got demolished. So this wasn't a program to like rehouse people who live in precarious conditions whilst they wait. This was we're going to demolish your area because we want to build something else there. And if it's a state agency demolishing, maybe you'll be lucky enough to be surveyed and get a house here. But if it's a private or private-public partnership, there's a higher possibility that you won't even be surveyed and you won't get anything. So this wasn't like really a government project about like uplifting poor people. It was really, what do we do with all these people whose homes we want to demolish? So it's a very different logic. And sometimes it would be justified as like people having built in high-risk zones, and some people had built in zones which were prone to flooding, etc. That's true. But I would be very averse to seeing this as like as in the same spirit as the original Reconstruction Development Program in South Africa, for instance. It comes from a very different place. And so initially in these areas, for instance, they would just build houses. There wouldn't be schools, there wouldn't be clinics, there wouldn't be anything else. And there's a woman I interviewed who told me she was in the first batch of people to be removed in 2001, when they were actually put in tents and told they had to build their own homes. And she said it was so quiet and kind of dead in that area. And I've never gotten this line. She said she could have lain down in the road all day and no car would have run over her because there was no one going there.
Yeah, because that's my problem with some of these government-led initiatives in Southern Africa. With Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia. You see, government just comes ruthlessly, afflicts people for their own interest or political interest, but without looking at the future. Even for the sustainability of these kind of projects, when people have no means of livelihood, there are no jobs, there is nothing, no services, how do you expect these people to make it in?
No, so like the first few, I mean, so now these areas look very different. Now there are schools and there are like people have turned them into other areas. But if you read about like the first few years of Zangu, like people just like abandoned those areas and moved back to the city center because it was unsustainable. They weren't like, you know, minibus taxi routes going out there or official public transport or anything. So imagine you work in the city center in a house, your house is fairly near to there, and you get moved out. I mean, like with no traffic at all, and Luanda has a lot of traffic, I'd say it's at least like an hour's drive to this area from the center. And that's with zero traffic. That's like you get on the road and nothing bars your way. So if you're moved here in like 2001 when the war is still going on, you're already in trouble. But like there was a slower recognition on the part of the state, that there needed to be some other kinds of what they called social infrastructures built. And so you have seen that, and also people providing themselves. But yes, those were not kind of initially built into the plan, or if they were in the plan, were not actually built. I don't know.
Hi, Dorothy
Hi.
Hudson. I'm just visiting here for Deer too. Thank you for a fabulous and really fascinating talk. And I appreciate that it's about power building aesthetics and so forth. But I love the extent you can, if you could disaggregate the term people that you
Sure.
keep using.
Sure.
In my background, perhaps some of the gender or age, or like, are these, for the first time you spoke about a woman kind of being moved in, but is there a presumption that these are kind of, you know, households with a man and a woman? Are there female-headed households? I mean, particularly after the war and so forth, there must be a dominance of them. Is there anything you can tell me about who they are? Is there a kind of age, a common age demographic?
Sure.
Whatever, because I know that wasn't necessarily.
Yeah.
just the
No.
focus, but I'd
I
love
can.
to pull that
Yeah.
focus.
I mean, the big criteria which they claim to be using was the person who owned the principal house on a plot. So if you were a renter, you did not get rehoused. So it wasn't necessarily, from what I could see, there wasn't a presumption that this was a male-headed household or that you had to be a specific kind of earner. It was like, is there a house? If you are the person, and you could be whoever could be a man, and there are many female-headed households in Angola. So it could, so I can't claim that I saw like an explicitly gendered aspect to like who the state decided to give to. That being said, I think there would have been very differential effects on employment, because I mean, a lot of men are in the informal sector in Angola as well, but things like selling food, for instance, water, are generally seen as very like feminized roles, and sometimes actually aren't actually described as work. Like if you sometimes interview households and you ask to work, they'll be like, well, whatever, my wife doesn't work, she just sells things. Okay. And so if you are making your income from like the market or being like an ambulant trader, this becomes a big problem. But it was also a problem in some ways. Ultimately, I think some of the more informal trades might have done better, because for people who worked in formal positions in the city, the transport issue became problematic. Age-wise, the big problem for kids was really schooling, because these areas initially had no schools. And so what you saw was sometimes people having to divide up family units. So you would have like an adult in the household come here and try to figure out in the meantime what they were going to do with this space. Children being sent to different people in the city to ensure that they could continue with their schooling, and maybe like one adult to stay in the city center with someone else so that there was some income coming in whilst someone here. Like there was one family I knew where like the wife was trying to turn, they had gotten 2 units actually for the size of their house. And she was trying to turn one of the units into a restaurant. So she was setting that up while her husband was largely in the city during the week and would come out on the weekend. So I wasn't explicitly looking at it. I didn't note any like obvious gender division in terms of who was allocated a house, but I think there are quite notable in terms of kind of economic, and then age-wise, you know, where you are at life stage made a big impact. University students as well was a big problem. I don't know if that, yeah.
No, thank you.
Nikia, you were unmuted. You can ask your question, and you can look. There is one question on the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Claudia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I really like your presentation, and also I would want to take it to the question of, firstly, you know, the land of placenta. People, when they are removed from the land where they're born and where their placenta is buried, you know, their social fabric would be broken away with their neighborhoods and family. So what has happened? Because similar events are happening the same way you're seeing the case in Angola, Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau are in the same vein of redeveloping or developing or urbanization, whatever the name is. And so it's recently I heard, you know, the South African president Cyril Ramaphosa praising Addis Ababa for growing beautiful, whereas at the cost of so many people who have been dislocated from their area, and that kind of development has missed the opportunity of growing organically. And the native mentality is gone. For example, Ethiopia, particularly Addis Ababa, that didn't have any kind of colonial baggage, and, you know, Western kinds of city development influence has now adopted and has become too much westernized. So what's beauty without people, and to what end? And therefore the question is, where is the human-centered development and where is the balance? Thank you, Dr. Claudia. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much. I mean, I would completely agree with you. And I think part of the problem, and that's one of the questions I'm kind of trying to pursue in the book, is precisely, in a sense, the lack of recognition that there are ways to think and plan which can look at what has already been organically built. These sort of new cities across the continent or like new urban precincts, etc., are catering to what is a real demand. People want better urban conditions. And I don't think anyone's going to like argue that people don't want trash collection in their cities, okay? But where I really agree with you is I think that our planners have been really, in some sense, unimaginative in what the possibilities of planning are and how to include not just what has already been built, but who already lives in the city in there. And I mean, Ethiopia, I have not been to Addis, but almost every time I've presented on my work, someone has raised Addis. So I feel like I need to go and see, because it just sounds like what has happened there has been so dramatic and so shocking. And part of what I'm also trying to look at is, in some ways, Luanda is an extreme of a process that I think has been happening more slowly in other cities, in that because of the civil war, a huge number of people there of a certain generation were not born in Luanda. I mean, they came in, but you do have now multiple generations of people who are from Luanda, who actually don't necessarily, for instance, have strong links to a rural area or a village somewhere. They're very much Luandans, if you want. And I think African governments have really had difficulty grappling with thinking about people who are from cities and therefore have a voice in cities and need to be seen as, if you want, people who are bearing their placentas in cities, not necessarily in an ancestral village. And I think that's really going forward something that countries are going to have to grapple with a lot more in planning.
May I read this question?
So yeah, I can't see it.
So I wonder if you could open up a bit the notion of the cantons and how it relates to land rights. How is a land ownership of a canton justified if all land belongs to the state?
Sure. So I'm going to backtrack a bit just to explain a bit more like the category of campones. And this comes from other people's work, someone like Ruth Castel Branco, who's at the WITS Southern Center for Inequality Studies, etc., has done work on this. Basically, the term camponese was a term that the colonial state used for any Black person who was farming, regardless of whether they had a commercial farm, a small-scale farm, didn't matter what the size of the product, you became a camponese. It's also a word that has been kind of used for communities which appear to be living according to like customary law. And so it's kind of this weird word that covers a lot of stuff that could actually all be very different. But that's what's used. And in Portuguese, it actually means peasant, which also doesn't necessarily correlate well with kind of what's being discussed. But why camponese land ownership is protected is that even though, according to the Constitution, all land in Angola technically belongs to the state, there are provisions through which land can be ceded or recognized by certain groups. And one of them are camponeses, who are recognized as having like customary or traditional land holding, which has recognized kind of legal ramifications. So one of them is that if camponeses want to sell land, they first have to offer it to the state before they offer it to anybody else. And so this was one of the ways in which, for instance, in Luanda, when camponeses sold off land to people who wanted to build, later on the state could say like, oh, well, the sale was technically illegal because it should have been given to the state first, for instance, should have been offered to the state. And so, especially in kind of, I would say, and so there's camponeses who are still recognized kind of within cities or peri-urban areas, if you want, but the more you get into kind of rural areas, the more you're going to see kind of that assertion of kind of customary land rights. And there's a lot more that needs to be done on that in Angola. I actually think it's a very, I think partially because of the Civil War, et cetera, and then initially the difficulties of kind of, especially coming from outside, moving across the country, it's really sort of rural Angola has been very understudied in comparison to the cities.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Sure.
It's a very interesting presentation, and
Sure.
like you said, it's a little shocking to run across the border from Malawi. it must be a combination of, oil money, right?
Yeah.
And then just doing something at that scale. I know there's building programs and stuff they're doing in South Korea and other places. You just build a city and then people come and move in already. It looks like they're doing this in neighborhoods, but
Yeah.
but in those cases, then they're building a downtown area and everything, the services and all that. But this seems like, just the housing, just you're isolated from anything else. And then also, I have another question is, these places and this concept of just building a house and then handing it to somebody, this doesn't seem sustainable either. So I'm wondering about, it's almost like a handout, right? And this notion of moving away from handouts, my experience is that you hand something out, then the tendency is some of the people will sell it quickly, and there are people with money come in, and there are situations where people are getting this type of houses. Can they then change it, upgrade it, build, and like get a 2 or 3 of those houses and make build a bigger house out of them? What kind of protections are there from those kinds of things as well? I just wondering. And then this relative balance between private sector and government. So the private sector more choosy about where they build, closer to the amenities. Are the private sector doing better with the services? There's lots of questions, but
no. So I think it's important. Can I go back to my screen just to show something? That's possible. So there was a distinction between like the Zangu, like the kind of single plot houses, whatever, so like the low ones, and then those high rises that I showed. The high rises were, okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. So the high rises were really built, if you want, for a middle class.
Okay.
So like that city, like the city that became very famous, well, the satellite city was called Quilamba. It was like the flagship city just on the outskirts of Luanda. It was meant to be built for 500,000 people. I don't think it's reached that number. But like, oh, whoops. Yeah, I think it'll come back in a second. Okay, there we go. So like these areas is where people who had their homes demolished were moved to. But this was different. So this place, Quilamba, has services. It has its own water treatment station. It had like a, I don't know what it would be called here, like a social security office here, like where you could go get an ID, you could register for stuff, you could get a birth certificate. It had space for shops that could be turned. So, and this was really aimed at like a middle class, aspirant middle class. Like when it opened up, in the first phase, the apartments were priced too high. They were priced at $125,000 for like a 1 bedroom, I think, and that got altered. And then they switched it to a $400 a month, like a lease to own program. So it was managed by a kind of a company, Baltic companies, most recently, I think, in Justin, for the state, and people. You would have to go there, show that you were Angolan, in theory, show that you didn't have a house, or that some people did already have houses, and then apply, and you would be like allocated an apartment to then pay off. And what happened were like some of these apartment blocks were allocated to specific ministries, so that like employees of, I don't know, the Ministry of Justice could get apartments in Quilamba. And this is actually a long-standing practice during the socialist period as well. When the Cubans built apartment blocks, they either went to like internationalist volunteers, people who worked for the UN, or people who worked for state companies or ministries. So if you were like a high-ranking civil servant, Ministry of Education, you could maybe get a house. So that's actually, this looks very new, but the logic about how things are being allocated actually has quite a long history. And these had services. And so the lack of services, there was real class and income division and geographic division between who was getting areas with services and schools, etc. So there was like a primary school built for this area, like multiple creches, maybe even a high school, I don't remember, a medical center, like that was all planned in this. but not in the other one. So that kind of distinction is there. In terms of handout, it's hard to say because people did have their houses. So it's like, is it a handout if their house got demolished? I think what we tend to think is not sustainable is what seems to be like the chaos of it. And yet it's kind of took on its own life. I don't think I would be interested, can't say if some state institution still has a handle on who lives where and who is, in theory owns what. I suspect not. I don't know. I mean, because it also, these areas were built under special offices of the presidency. And so even tracking who would actually have a register of who in theory was moved there, like the office that moved people was called the Program for the Rehousing of the Population. I don't think it exists anymore. So I don't know like where those lists went. And so I think there's also a really interesting story about kind of this state, which has very often been described for Angola, is both very strong and institutionally very disorganized. So it has the capacity to organize building this, but then has like, or even like this, which is, one might not like it as much, but it takes a lot of effort to plan, to construct, to kind of allocate houses. But then once it comes to kind of the governance and the running, things sort of start to fray, so I don't really have an answer about how like sustainable that is, but this has, to your other point, as I was saying, has been altered. Like some people, bought houses next to them and then stretched the house out across and like knocked down walls or like built another level. This is a road, so there's a little bit of like an area behind. But let's say this area, people would try to like claim as much of the area behind and build a wall, so that would be like their part to try and like eat into the neighbor's potential plot, right? So you would try and build it out, so that they couldn't take it. So there's been a lot of alteration, like a lot. And again, at first, like there was a department which I don't even think it exists anymore. What is it? Something for housing. I'd have to remember. There were so many acronyms, but there was an institute that was specifically in charge of these areas, which tried to stop people from doing alterations, but didn't really work. The private sector, I don't know. So these were built through the state. What happened was, let's say if you're a private developer, you would go to the Program for the Rehousing of the Population and say, I want to build whatever, like an apartment block in that area, but there's a musek there. And they would say, okay, well, you need to do a survey. This is like in theory. You need to do a survey. You do the survey. You say there's 100 people living in 30 houses. I need 30 houses allocated to me somewhere in Zango. And they would say, okay, well, we don't have 30 houses. We can build 30 houses. Here are the models of the house in that area where we can allocate you. But now you tell me, in the ideal world, this is like the house is everything, but what can you afford? Can you afford a water connection? Can you afford an electricity connection? Can you afford a sanitation connection? Can you afford for the house to have nice finishings? If you can't, we could build the house, but without a water connection. So the private sector's involvement in this is also kind of weird because you have big discrepancies between different parts of this, depending on who was paying for the houses to get built. And to be fair to the Angolan state, which is sometimes a hard thing to say, at least the people I interviewed, areas which had been built by institutions connected to the state tended to be slightly better than areas funded through private companies who wanted to not have to add on anything if they could.
We're out of time.
Okay.
So thank you so
Sure.
much. Thank you, everybody.
Sure. Thank you.